Previously on, the Korean Mafia boss ordered his convoy to stop for a bullied black woman. I must say that your love for the part 1 of this story inspired this part 2. You may need to watch the part 1 first to help you catch up with this sequel. Before we begin, like this video, subscribe if you haven't, and comment where you're watching from. Now let's dive into it.
The heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom didn't just open, they retreated, as if the very architecture of the building sensed the arrival of something predatory. Inside, the air was a suffocating blend of expensive cedar and the forced laughter of men who believed they owned the wind. Iva Brighton stood at the threshold, her silhouette framed by the clinical blue headlights of the convoy idling in the rain behind her. She was no longer the woman in the ruin of silk and grime. Her dress was a column of midnight velvet, and though her ribs still throbbed with the ghost of a bully's boot, she wore the pain like a hidden blade. Beside her, Park Jae-hyun remained a silent, looming presence. He didn't need to speak. The way the light caught the tattoos creeping up his neck and the razor-sharp line of his black suit told the room exactly who had arrived. The Apex protocol hadn't ended at the penthouse, it had simply changed venues. Iva scanned the room, her gaze cutting through the smoke of Cuban cigars until it landed on a circle of silver-haired men in the corner. At the center stood Arthur Vance, the architect of the city's logistics empire and the father of the boy who had tried to break her in an alleyway. To the world, Arthur was a titan of industry. To Iva, he was the source of the rot. She began to walk. The rhythmic click of her heels on the marble floor acted like a metronome, slowing the tempo of the gala until the quartet's music faltered and died. The board of directors turned, their expressions shifting from irritation to a confused, prickling fear. They didn't recognize her, not yet. To them, she was a ghost they had spent millions trying to keep buried. As she reached the circle, the air grew cold, a liquid nitrogen chill that replaced the warmth of the crystal chandeliers. Arthur Vance straightened his silk tie, his eyes narrowing. "This is a private function, young lady. I don't believe you're on the guest list." "You're right, Arthur," Iva said, her voice steady and resonant, carrying the weight of 15 years of silence. "I wasn't on the list for the fire at Crescent Heights either, but I was there. I was the girl in the laundry chute while you signed the insurance papers." Vance's face didn't just pale, it seemed to erode. The glass of vintage scotch in his hand trembled, the amber liquid catching the light. He looked from Iva to the stoic, tattooed man standing half a step behind her, and the realization hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't a social call. This was a reckoning. "Your son thought I was a casualty of malice," Iva continued, stepping into his personal space, forcing him to smell the rain still clinging to her skin. "You thought I was someone who could be discarded in the trash, but I am the face of every person you thought didn't matter. I am the variable you couldn't calculate." Jae-hyun leaned in, his voice a low, gravelly promise that made the other directors recoil. "The audit has already begun, Arthur. By the time the sun rises, the board won't just be out of business. You'll be out of shadows."
Iva didn't look away. She watched the sweat break on the elder Vance's brow, savoring the moment the predator realized he had become the prey. The white-hot rage from the alley had cooled into a sharp, lethal clarity. She wasn't burning down. She was finally, beautifully on fire. The transition from the ballroom to the tactical command center was seamless, a shift from the theater of war to its cold, hard mechanics. In the high-altitude silence of Park Jae-hyun's penthouse, the only sound was the low hum of cooling fans and the rhythmic tapping of keys. Min Ho, Jae-hyun's lead technician and a man who existed entirely in the shadows, sat enveloped in the glow of 6 monitors, his fingers dancing across the interface like a pianist playing a dark concerto. Jae-hyun stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his reflection ghostly against the backdrop of the city lights he was currently dismantling. He didn't look back as Iva entered the room. She had traded the midnight velvet for a sharp, tailored suit, armor for a different kind of battlefield. The Apex Protocol had entered its second phase, the systematic erasure of the board's financial footprint. "They're moving," Minho murmured, his voice devoid of emotion. The elder Vance just authorized a series of offshore transfers, 17 million to a shell company in the Caymans. They're trying to bleed their accounts dry before the freeze hits. Jae-hyun's jaw tightened, the ink on his neck seeming to pulse under the recessed lights. "Let them run. It only makes the trail easier to follow. Iva, the federal audit is live. How does the board react when their legitimate front is stripped away?" Iva walked to the central table, where a digital map of the city's logistics network was projected. She pointed to a cluster of hubs at the south side docks. "They won't just panic, they'll cannibalize each other. Vance's logistics firm relies on a delicate web of favors from the port authorities. If we leak the audit results to the internal stakeholders now, the smaller directors will turn on Vance to save their own pensions. They aren't loyal to him, they're loyal to the gold." Minho tapped a final sequence. "Communications intercepted. I have the board's private encrypted channel. They're currently arguing about which one of them is going to take the fall for the Crescent Heights insurance fraud." The irony wasn't lost on Iva. 15 years ago, she had been a ghost in a laundry chute, terrified and ignored, while these men calculated the value of human life in terms of real estate. Now their lives were being reduced to lines of code on her screen. "Freeze the assets," Jae-hyun ordered. Mahogany-paneled offices and private villas, the board's black cards would go cold. Their wire transfers would hang in digital limbo, flagged by agents who had been waiting for a reason to look at the Vance family for a decade. Jae-hyun finally turned, his clinical blue eyes finding Iva's. There was no triumph in his expression, only a dark, shared understanding. "The logistics of war isn't about the size of the army, Iva. It's about who controls the air they breathe. We just turned off their oxygen." The room fell silent as they watched the monitors turn red one by one, signaling the collapse of the Vance Empire's liquidity. The hunters were now the hunted, trapped in a gilded cage of their own making, while the girl they thought didn't matter watched the light fade from their world. The digital landscape of the city's municipal archives was a labyrinth of buried secrets, but Iva moved through it with the practiced ease of a master locksmith. Before the alleyway, before the convoy, she had spent years navigating the sterile, high-stakes corridors of the corporate world. She knew that men like Arthur Vance didn't just commit crimes. They filed them away under boring headings, hiding their sins in plain sight behind layers of bureaucratic jargon. Jae-hyun watched her from the periphery, his large frame silhouetted against the glow of the data streams. He was a man of physical consequence, of steel, shadows, and blood, but he watched Iva with a look of profound respect. He recognized that while he could break a man's bones, Iva was currently dismantling a legacy. "Crescent Heights was never just an accident," Iva murmured, her eyes reflecting the rapid scroll of blue text. "And it wasn't just about intimidation. Look at the zoning timestamps." Her fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up the 15-year-old property deeds. On the night of the fire, the night she had huddled in a laundry chute and a young Jae-hyun had fought for air, the land had been valued at a pittance. But 3 hours before the first alarm was raised, a shell company owned by a subsidiary of the board had filed a preemptive bid for the entire block.
"They didn't burn it to send a message," she whispered, the cold clarity in her voice sharper than any blade. "They burned it because the tenants refused to leave, and the board couldn't secure the logistics hub they wanted while the building was still standing. The fire was the eviction notice." She clicked deeper, bypassing a series of corrupted, encrypted layers that had baffled federal investigators for over a decade. Her ghost-in-the-machine approach worked because she understood the board's specific dialect of greed. She found it. The Crescent Heights Logistics Expansion Plan. It was a digital blueprint of the very world they now stood in, built on the ashes of her childhood home.
The file contained more than just maps. It held the disposable casualty list, a spreadsheet of every family in the building categorized by how much it would cost to silence them. Her own name was there, marked with a single chilling annotation: unaccounted for, likely deceased. "We were just line items," Eva said, her voice trembling, not with fear, but with the sheer magnitude of the injustice. "We were numbers on a balance sheet that needed to be zeroed out." Jae-hyun stepped closer, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder, a rare gesture of grounding warmth. The metallic tang of the past seemed to fill the room, but they were no longer helpless children in the smoke. "They thought they zeroed you out, Eva," Jae-hyun said, his voice a low, predatory "but they forgot to carry the remainder. Now you're the only number that matters. You're the one that's going to bankrupt them." Eva closed the file and looked at the clock. The sun was still hours from rising, and they finally had the one thing the board feared more than the Mafia: the truth, documented and ready to be weaponized. The ghost had finally stepped out of the machine, and she was coming for everything they owned. The silence of the penthouse was shattered, not by a sound, but by the sudden, violent death of the city lights outside. One by one, the glowing grids of the skyline blinked out, plunged into a coordinated blackout that swallowed the streets below. Jae-hyun froze, his hand hovering over the glass table. In the dim emergency red light that flickered to life, his face didn't show fear, it showed a cold, lethal recognition. "Minho!" Jae-hyun barked, but the monitors were already screaming. "The perimeter is breached! This isn't the board's private security. Thermal signatures show high-altitude descent. They're coming from the roof. It's the Iron Fang Syndicate." Eva felt the air in the room grow heavy, the same metallic tang of danger she had felt in the alleyway, now amplified by the scale of a multi-million-dollar hit. The board hadn't just panicked. They had spent the last of their liquid assets to buy the only thing that could challenge a Mafia boss, an international rival with a taste of scorched earth. The first explosion rocked the floor, a concussion grenade that sent a wave of pressure through the glass windows. Eva was thrown back, but before she could hit the ground, a strong arm caught her. Jae-hyun pulled her behind the reinforced marble kitchen island, his body acting as a shield. He drew a sleek, matte black pistol from his shoulder holster, his movements fluid and instinctive. "Stay low," he whispered, his eyes locked on the ceiling. "They want the data, but they'll kill the messenger to get it. You are the only one who can testify to that land grab, Iva. You are their target now." Above them, the sound of shattered glass rained down like diamonds. Half a dozen figures in tactical gear swung through the skylights, their movements synchronized and silent. These were not the clumsy bullies from her past. They were professional ghosts. The red emergency lights caught the glint of their specialized weaponry, casting long, demonic shadows across the walls. The room erupted in a rhythmic staccato of gunfire. Jae-hyun returned fire with a clinical precision that was terrifying to behold. He moved like a shadow among shadows, his suit a blur of dark motion. He wasn't just defending his home, he was defending the only person who remembered the boy he used to be.
Iva pressed her back against the marble, her heart hammering against her ribs. For a moment, the old urge to retreat, to hide in the laundry chute of her mind, flared up. But then she looked at the tablet in her hand, still glowing with the evidence of the Crescent Heights fire. She realized that if she disappeared now, the truth died with her. "Jae-hyun, the elevator!" she shouted, noticing a secondary thermal flare on the security panel near the foyer. He spun, taking down a mercenary near the hallway, but a second team had already bypassed the main doors. A flashbang detonated near the center of the room, a blinding white light that erased the world. Through the ringing in her ears, Iva heard the scuffle of heavy boots and the muffled grunt of a physical struggle. When her vision cleared, the room was a ruin of smoke and debris. Jae-hyun was standing over 2 downed attackers, but a third had managed to close the distance, a combat knife glinting in the red light. "The convoy is 5 minutes out," Minho's voice screamed over the speakers. But as Iva watched the mercenary lunge for Jae-hyun, she realized 5 minutes was an eternity. The board had struck back with everything they had, and for the first time, the Apex protocol was being tested to its breaking point. The metallic ring of the knife hitting the floor was eclipsed by the sickening thud of the Iron Fang mercenary's final blow. Jae-hyun didn't fall. He collapsed like a monolith, his body shielding Iva even as his consciousness flickered out. The red emergency light caught the dark spreading stain on his shoulder where the blade had found its mark. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the ragged breathing of the girl from the chute and the distant, rising wail of sirens. Iva didn't scream. The white-hot rage that had been born in a rainy alleyway had finally frozen into something diamond-hard. She looked at the man who had stopped his world for her, now motionless at her feet, and then she looked at the tactical radio dropped by the downed mercenary. "Minho," she said, her voice a low, vibrating blade. "Status." "The penthouse is a kill zone." Minho's voice crackled, frantic. "The Iron Fang has a second wave coming up the service stairs. The convoy is at the service entrance, but they won't move without Jae-hyun's biometric authorization. Iva, you have to hide." "No," Iva replied, standing up and stepping over the ruin of the room. She grabbed Jae-hyun's discarded matte black pistol, not with hesitation, but with a grim, inherited necessity. "Open the private elevator. We're coming down." "Iva, you can't." "Open it, Minho, now." With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she hauled Jae-hyun's heavy frame into the elevator, his blood warm and terrifying against her suit. When the doors hissed open at the sub-basement, the 6-car convoy was already idling, their clinical blue headlights cutting through the exhaust smoke like the eyes of waiting predators. A dozen bodyguards stood like statues, their faces masks of confusion as they saw their king carried by the woman they had been told only to protect. "Boss is down," one shouted, reaching for his weapon. "Stand down," Iva's voice echoed through the concrete garage, sharp enough to stop a bullet. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like the storm. "He's alive, but he's out. Get him in the second sedan. Medical team on him now." The men hesitated, their loyalty tethered to a man who couldn't lead them. Iva stepped into the light of the lead sedan, the very seat where Jae-hyun had first looked at her and gone pale. She held up the tablet containing the Crescent Heights files, the digital soul of the board's demise. "The Crescent Heights is coming, and the board thinks they've won. They think we're ghosts. Let's show them what happens when ghosts stop hiding. Apex protocol, full engagement. I am the voice of the chair until he wakes up. Move." The air shifted. The bodyguard saw not a stranger, but the person Jae-hyun had chosen to stand beside him. They moved with the synchronized precision of a machine. Jae-hyun was loaded into the back of the armored car, and Iva slid into the passenger seat of the lead vehicle. She tapped the comms on the dashboard. "Minho, route us to the Vance estate. If they want a war, we're bringing it to their front door. No more shadows. No more silence. The lead driver looked at her, a flicker of respect crossing his stoic face. He shifted the car into gear. The engines roared in unison, a predatory growl that shook the foundation of the building. The convoy surged forward, a seamless, armored wave of retribution. And for the first time, Eva Brighton wasn't just part of the equation. She was the one solving it. The lead sedan didn't belong in the South Side. Its deep obsidian finish was a foreign object among the rusted fire escapes and the flickering orange hum of ancient street lamps. As the convoy slowed to a crawl through the narrow arteries of her old neighborhood, Eva felt the weight of 1,000 hidden eyes. This was the place where people learned to be invisible, where survival meant blending into the gray brick and the persistent damp of the coastal air. Eva stepped out of the car before the driver could reach the door. The air here didn't smell like sandalwood or expensive cedar. It smelled of salt, exhaust, and the fried dough from the corner bakery that had been there since she was 6. She looked up at the skeletal remains of Crescent Heights, the charred lot that had never been rebuilt, standing as a jagged tooth in the city's skyline. "They aren't coming out for a Mafia boss," Eva said softly to the radio in her ear, aware that Jae-yoon was still unconscious but being monitored by the team in the car behind her. "And they won't come out for a woman in a suit. They'll only come out for one of their own." She walked toward the shadows beneath the elevated train tracks where the ghosts of the neighborhood gathered, the delivery drivers, the night shift cleaners, the couriers who moved through the city unnoticed. They were the ones the board of directors treated as background noise. A group of young men in hooded sweatshirts straightened as she approached, their expressions guarded, ready for a threat. But as Eva stepped into the pool of light from a buzzing street lamp, she didn't hide the fading hematoma on her cheek or the hardness in her eyes. She pulled a worn, laminated ID card from her pocket, her old employee badge from the days before the world tried to break her. "I'm Eva Brighton," she said, her voice cutting through the distant rumble of the train. "I lived in 4C before the fire. My mother worked the docks, and my father died in a warehouse fire that never happened, according to the Vance insurance adjusters." The tension in the air didn't evaporate. It transformed into a heavy communal silence. One of the men, older than the rest, with hands calloused by decades of manual labor, stepped forward. He looked at the black sedans, then back at Eva. "We heard what happened at the gala. Word travels fast when the giants start to scream." "They're screaming because they're afraid," Eva said, her voice rising with a resonant power. "The board of directors thinks the city is a machine they control, but they forgot who actually turns the gears. I don't need soldiers. Jae-yoon has plenty of those. I need the eyes and ears of the South Side."
"I need to know every car that leaves the Vance estate, every courier carrying a physical drive, every secret they try to bury in the dark." She reached into her jacket and pulled out a stack of encrypted burner-phones provided by Min Ho. "The board calls you casualties. I call you the revolution. Help me finish what they started 15 years ago, and when the sun rises, this neighborhood won't be a ghost town anymore. It will be yours." One by one, the shadows began to move. Hands reached out from the darkness to take the devices. There was no cheering, no fanfare, only the quiet, grim resolve of people who had been waiting for a reason to stop hiding. Eva watched as her new network vanished back into the alleyways, 1,000 invisible threads now connecting her to every corner of the city. The board thought they were fighting a mafia boss. They didn't realize they were now being watched by the very streets they had paved over. The Vance Global Tower pierced the low-hanging clouds like a glass spear, but tonight the light at its summit was flickering. At the base of the monolith, the convoy arrived, not as a line of cars, but as an absolute statement of ownership. The clinical blue headlights washed over the lobby's gold-leafed revolving doors, signaling the end of an era.
Eva stepped out into the biting wind, her gaze fixed on the top floor. Beside her, Jae-hyun stood steady, his shoulder bandaged and his jaw set in a line of hard granite. He was pale, but his presence was a gravitational force. He looked at Eva, then at the building that represented everything that had once crushed her. "They're all inside," he said, his voice a low, gravelly promise. "They've locked the elevators and called for their private security. They think the glass will save them." Eva didn't answer with words. She raised the burner phone provided by the South Side network. "Now," she commanded. Across the street, in the shadows of an alleyway, a maintenance worker, one of the many ghosts she had recruited, flipped a manual override switch in a nondescript utility box. Inside the tower, the system began to cannibalize itself. The state-of-the-art security grid, built to keep the world out, suddenly clamped shut, trapping the board of directors in their own boardroom. The elevators froze, the digital locks engaged. The hunters had become the exhibits. "Apex Protocol," Eva said, looking at the stoic men in black suits who stood ready behind her. "Take the lobby." The siege was a seamless, armored wave. Jae-hyun's men moved with a terrifying, silent efficiency, neutralizing the corporate security teams before a single alarm could be raised. Eva and Jae-hyun walked through the chaos as if it were a garden path, their footsteps echoing on the marble. They didn't need to shoot a shot. The psychological weight of the South Side's eyes and the Mafia's steel had already won the battle. When they finally bypassed the executive override and stepped into the 80th floor boardroom, the scene was one of pathetic, high-end desperation. Arthur Vance and the other directors were huddled around a mahogany table, frantically shouting into phones that no longer had a signal. The panoramic windows showed a city that was no longer theirs. "The doors are magnetic, Arthur," Eva said, her voice cutting through the panic like a cold snap. "They won't open until I tell them to, and I won't tell them to until you look at me." Arthur Vance turned, his eyes wide with a frantic, cornered energy. "This is kidnapping. This is an eviction," Jae-hyun interrupted, stepping into the light, his hand resting on the back of Iva's chair as she took the seat at the head of the table. Iva leaned forward, the glow of the city behind her, framing her like a dark halo. On the massive digital screen behind her, the Crescent Heights files began to scroll, the proof of the land grab, the insurance fraud, and the cost of human lives. "You built this tower on the ashes of my home," Iva said, her voice steady and resonant. "You thought you could automate the world so you'd never have to look at the people you broke. But the system has a leak, Arthur, and I'm the one who's going to drown you in it." The directors looked at each other, the realization dawning that there was no legal loophole big enough to crawl through this time. The seamless wave had finally reached the top floor, and as the sirens of the arriving federal authorities, alerted by Minho's data dump, began to wail below, Iva Brighton finally let go of the girl in the laundry chute. She was the one holding the keys now. The digital scent of ozone and the heavy weight of silence filled the boardroom as Iva held the tablet that now controlled every circuit in the Vance Global Tower. With a single swipe, she could trigger the emergency pressure release in the basement generators. The building wouldn't just lose power, it would become a hollowed-out husk of glass and steel, a bonfire visible from every corner of the South Side. It would be poetic, a mirror to the Crescent Heights fire that had shaped her life. Arthur Vance was on his knees, his silk suit rumpled, his hands trembling as he stared at the red system overload prompt on the massive wall monitors. "Please," he croaked, the sound stripped of its boardroom authority. "We can settle this. Name your price. I'll give you the land back. I'll give you 10 times what it's worth." Jae-hyun stood by the door, a dark sentinel watching Iva with an unreadable expression. He didn't offer advice or restraint. He simply watched the way her finger hovered over the glass. He had given her the matches. It was up to her to decide if she wanted to see the world burn. The white-hot rage that had fueled her journey from the alleyway was pulsing in her temples, a rhythmic demand for total annihilation. Iva looked at her reflection in the darkened panoramic window. She saw the new variable in the equation, dressed in high-end armor, her eyes reflecting the crimson glow of the emergency lights. But beneath the sharp tailoring, she could still feel the phantom needles of the rain and the metallic tang of the alley's blood. If she triggered the overload, she would be the hero of the South Side for a night, but she would become the very monster she was hunting, a person who treated architectural landmarks and human safety as disposable assets in a personal war. "You think this is about money, Arthur?" Iva asked, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than any scream. "You think you can buy back the 15 years I spent trying to be invisible? You think you can pay for the oxygen my mother lost in that laundry chute?" She stepped toward the window, looking down at the city. Far below, the clinical blue headlights of the convoy were joined by the red and blue strobes of federal sirens. The shadows of the South Side were down there too, watching and waiting. They weren't waiting for a fire. They were waiting for a change. "If I burn this building, I'm just the next version of you," Iva said, her voice turning from liquid nitrogen to something even harder. "I'm not the girl from the chute anymore, Arthur, and I'm not your executioner." With a sharp, decisive motion, she swiped the tablet to secure and transfer. Instead of an explosion, a progress bar appeared on every screen in the room. Every encrypted file, every recorded conversation, and every cent of the board's hidden offshore accounts began streaming directly to the Federal Bureau and the Public Southside Trust. "I'm the person who's taking your legacy and giving it back to the people you stole it from," she said. Jae-hyun's lips curved into a rare, dangerous smile. He stepped forward and placed a hand on her shoulder, not to guide her, but to acknowledge her. The price of justice wasn't blood. It was the total, systemic erasure of the board's power. As the elevator doors finally chimed, signaling the arrival of the authorities, Iva stood tall. She hadn't become a monster. She had become something much more terrifying to men like Vance, an equal. The first rays of dawn didn't break over the city so much as they bled into it, a pale, honeyed light that struggled to pierce the lingering haze of the night's transition. The Vance Global Tower, once a symbol of untouchable elitism, now was swarmed by the clinical white and blue of federal vehicles. The board of directors were being led out in silence, their high-priced leather shoes treading the same pavement where just 24 hours ago Iva Brighton had bled in the rain.
Iva stood on the sidewalk, watching the procession. She wasn't hiding in the shadows of an alley, and she wasn't standing in the path of a convoy as a plea for death. She stood with a quiet, terrifying grace, her dark eyes reflecting the rising sun. Beside her, Park Jae-hyun leaned against the hood of the lead black sedan. His bandaged shoulder was stiff, and his face bore the fatigue of a man who had spent a lifetime at war, but his gaze remained fixed on Iva. "The Southside Trust is already receiving the first wave of redirected assets," Minho reported from the driver's seat, his voice coming through the open window. "The logistics contracts are being restructured. For the first time in 15 years, the city's heart is beating again." Jae-hyun straightened, his clinical blue gaze scanning the street. The shadows of the South Side, the delivery drivers, the cleaners, the invisible workers, were beginning their morning shifts, but there was a new electricity in the air. They looked at the black convoy not with fear, but with the nod of a silent, shared victory.
It's not just a restructured city, Iva, Jae-yun said, his voice a low, gravelly hum that resonated in the morning air. It's a new equation, and you are the variable that changed the outcome. Iva looked at her hands. They were steady. The metallic tang of blood was gone, replaced by the crisp, cold scent of a new morning. She realized that she and Jae-yun were no longer defined by what had been stolen from them in the fire at Crescent Heights. They were no longer the boy in the smoke or the girl in the chute. "We spent so long being ghosts," Iva whispered, more to herself than to him. "Ghosts can't be killed, Iva," Jae-yun replied, reaching out to open the passenger door for her. "And now we're the only ones who know where all the bodies are buried. The city belongs to those who survive it, but it's ruled by those who remember." As she slid into the seat of power, Iva didn't look back at the tower or the broken men being loaded into transport vans. She looked forward, through the windshield, at the sprawling grid of the city that was now waking up to a different reality. The Apex Protocol wasn't just a security measure anymore. It was a promise. The engines of the 6-car convoy roared to life in a synchronized predatory growl. They moved away from the curb in a seamless armored wave, disappearing into the golden light of the new day. 2 ghosts had returned to claim everything, and as the sun climbed higher, the city finally learned their names. The fire wasn't behind them anymore. It was within them, lighting a path that no one would ever dare to block again.